Back when I was in college, the Student Campus Activity Council hired a famous ghost hunter to come speak at our school. I've always loved the paranormal, so I left my skeptical boyfriend behind on his dorm and hightailed it over to the auditorium. The ghost hunter was someone I'd never heard of, but he had an impressive background and seemed to have several things in the works at the time. This was in 2005. I think he actually might have a TV show now. He was a man of small stature with a little white professor's beard and a receding hairline. But the way he spoke about the afterlife was fascinating. You could tell he truly believed what he claimed to see. Either that, or he was a hell of a salesman. He had us hanging on every word. We watched some interesting video clips of his investigations. He had a nice collection of photos and scary stories to go with them. I remember one about a haunted doll that he said moved freely around the room of the person who had picked it up at a flea market, just not when anyone was around to witness it. Towards the end, he opened up the floor for questions. There were your typical dumbass college questions. Have you ever seen someone's head spin around like The Exorcist? Stuff like that, and a few that were actually pretty interesting. I decided I wasn't going to let this opportunity to speak to someone so apparently revered in the field of the supernatural slip away, so I raised my hand. The ghost hunter spotted me, pointed, and smiled. "Yes, you, the girl in the white shirt." "Yeah, hi," I said, and I know I sounded so nervous because I felt so dumb for sounding so nervous. I was just wondering, what's the scariest thing you can remember from your career as a ghost hunter? I was halfway back in the auditorium, quite a distance from the stage, but I saw his face fall. I know I did. "Well," he said, forcing a tight little laugh, "there are so many scary moments to recall. They tend to pop up quite often when you're in my line of work." This got a little chuckle from the audience. I suddenly felt pretty stupid for asking the question at all. He proceeded to tell some story about tracking a poltergeist in an abandoned elementary school and his flashlight failing. I remember because it really wasn't very scary, at least it didn't seem that way for someone who hunts ghosts for a living. He moved on from the story and answered a few more questions. He didn't look my way again. When it was over and everyone started to leave, I decided not to get stuck in the crush of students leaving through the front door. Feeling somewhat dejected, like I had done something wrong, I slipped quietly out the theater exit and headed for my dorm. The ghost hunter was sitting outside on a bench near the bike racks, smoking a cigarette. I ducked my head and tried to get by without him noticing. "Hey, kid." He took another drag and crushed the cigarette out on the cement bench beside him. "Listen, I'm sorry." I remember blurting, feeling like such a stupid little girl. "I know my question was dumb. I wasn't trying to make fun of you or anything." He shook his head. He brushed the ashes off the bench. He patted the space beside him, inviting me to sit. I hesitated. This could definitely be a case of stranger danger, just like they taught in the intro to university classes, then sat down, keeping a healthy distance between us. He was old and I was young. I could probably outrun the guy, or who knows, maybe I was just as stupid as I felt. "I didn't tell the truth," the ghost hunter said. His face looked much older, closer up, the wrinkles were deeper. The confident salesman aura had faded from him, leaving behind a man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of things. "That story I told, it wasn't the scariest moment of my career." "I know," I remember saying. He nodded, as though he had known I knew. "This is the scariest moment of my career," he said, and this is what he told me. "It was the 1970s. I was a much younger man. I hadn't reached success in the paranormal industry quite yet, and was left to pick up the scraps that the pros didn't want. Usually, they were schizophrenics whose broken minds tricked them into believing there were phantoms after them, or children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members of the neighborhood. If anything, it was a simple cleansing of the home with sage, and off I went. When I first got the call, I was ecstatic. What the client was describing appeared to be a full-blown demonic haunting, complete with physical manifestations, possession, and multiple witnesses. It was the break I was searching for. It was the break I needed. The only detail that truly worried me was that their teenage son, the person they claimed to be suffering from possession, had become violent with members of his family. Up until recently, he'd only acted out of character, moody. However, a week prior, he had tried to rape his older female cousin. She was shaken, but mostly unharmed. The family sent her to live elsewhere until it could all be figured out. Therefore, when I headed to their home, I made sure to arrive fully prepared. I brought holy water, crucifixes, sage, and, just for good measure, a small, loaded handgun. I knew it wouldn't come to that, but something about the mother's frantic tone over the phone told me it was just a good idea. I wish I could say the visit itself was exciting. Unfortunately, from the moment I pulled into the driveway of the beautiful remodeled Victorian, all activity seemed to stop. That is, if it was ever there to begin with. I spent 2 weeks investigating the home. I used equipment considered very technologically advanced for the era. I studied energy waves. I interviewed the son whose family claimed to be possessed when in fact he just seemed to be depressed, perhaps psychologically disturbed. I recommended a therapist, a renowned child psychologist who was famous for his work with violent young men. On the last day in the house, they took him into the city for treatment. His parents returned shortly before midnight, retiring wearily to their bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen to go over my findings. There was nothing to be said, and I knew it. Everything they described could be written off to the hysterics of a family who couldn't admit their son was in desperate need of medical attention. Everything, that is, except for the drains in the floor. Upon touring the home, I was impressed with how up-to-date it had been brought. It was clearly from the early 1900s and kept in immaculate condition. The woodwork and character of the house was carefully preserved as it was given necessary updates like modern plumbing and electricity. The basement was the only area that seemed stuck in time. The walls were a clammy stone that was prone to gathering moisture, leaving it unfit to store anything vulnerable to spiders or mold. The family had left it empty for this reason, and while it certainly felt very spooky to spend any amount of time in the windowless room with the single hanging light and its vast cement floors, I never recorded anything of note in this area. However, there was one thing I couldn't understand. Given the approximate time the home had been built and its presence in a residential neighborhood, there was simply no accounting for the 4 large, slotted drains set in the cold concrete floor. As I sat alone in the kitchen, poring over my meager findings, trying to find meaning in all these words, I heard something. It was only a little sound at first, and so I ignored it, but then it came again, louder this time. There was a steep spiral staircase that led to the second floor, winding up from the corner of the small kitchen, and it was there that the noise was coming from. Assuming it was simply one of the homeowners restless after dropping their son off in an institution, I glanced up. It was coming down the stairs. I can't say walking because that wasn't the case. It was just floating. Floating isn't even the right word. It was just coming down the stairs, straight at me. It had no eyes, it had no face, and yet somehow I knew it was looking at me, right at me, into the very depths of my soul. Then it spoke. I'm not sure how it spoke. I don't think I actually heard anything, so perhaps it used some sort of telepathy. Either way, I can recall the words to this very day.
You know what he did to us.
I didn't think. I couldn't. I just ran. I appended my chair when I fled, scattering papers across the kitchen that claimed this house wasn't really haunted. It was all the hallucinations of a very sick boy. I left them there. Do you know how awful that is? I left those people in that house with that thing. I didn't stop driving for 30 miles, for God's sakes, when I realized how far I'd gone. I finally pulled over and called the family from a payphone. They were the furthest thing from my mind when I saw it. All I could do was respond to the deep animal instinct to escape, to run out of that supposedly safe house with my tail between my legs. They moved, I think. I was then able to continue my investigation. In writing, I cited insufficient evidence, but I knew it was cowardice. I believe the house was leveled a few years later. I ended up doing my own research. Curiosity ate away at me with vicious little rat teeth as time went by, the accusation still ringing fresh in my ears.
You know what he did to us.
And eventually, yes, I did. Old newspaper clippings didn't tie the stories together, not necessarily, but I was able to piece some meaning out of the yellow excerpts. At some point, around the turn of the century, the house had been residence to a well-respected mortician. Unable to find a building in town to suit his needs, he said he built his own home office space. It was a grand feat of architecture and a shining example of a true entrepreneur, a man pursuing the American dream of running his own business. Upstairs, the bedroom, mid-level, the funeral home. In the basement, a mortuary. I knew what the drains were for. Separately, decades later, another well-respected member of the local community was arrested under the suspicion of abuse of his professional position, with moral cause. The newspaper didn't elaborate, probably due to the sensitive nature of the crimes, but his punishment was minor. After a brief stay in the local jail, the perpetrator stripped his home of all its value and left town before a trial, never to be seen again. It didn't take much to guess the connection. I suppose I don't know for sure, but the words of that thing still echo through my head to this day.
You know what he did to us.
There was a reason that mortician felt such a strong desire to build a house that contained his business to suit his needs. The things that were done to those bodies in the basement were unspeakable, but yes, I know what he did to them, and it's because of this, coming face to face with the true nature of man in its darkest place, that the encounter with that faceless thing is the scariest moment of my career. Because now, I know. I still remember his expression, the way all the color dropped out of him as he went on, the white hair of his beard barely distinguishable from his pale skin, the slump of his shoulders, the way his voice shook. I apologized. He waved me off. He left. I felt terrible. I still feel terrible for making him relive that moment. But as I grew up, as campus activities were replaced with bills and my own career, the ghost hunter fell from the forefront of my mind, little by little. Until last week, when I moved in with my fiancé, when I took the boxes into the basement despite his warnings of spiders and mold, because there's a large slotted drain in the center of the room, and I'm so worried, so scared about what I might know. I first heard this story when I was in college. I'd come home for a winter break, and I remember it was just me and my dad in the house. I was watching some kind of ghost hunters program on TV, just for laughs. I don't really believe in that stuff. When you watch the programs on the TV, they're just so obviously fake. It's too hard for me to let go of my preconceptions and just watch and try to get into it. My dad was the same way, so I thought. He didn't seem interested in the paranormal or anything. He was the kind of guy who would scoff at anything supernatural. The program I was watching flipped to a commercial and I casually got up and found my dad in the kitchen. Sort of out of the blue, I asked him, "Hey Dad, do you believe in ghosts?" "Yup." His reply was so casual, it shocked me. "Really?" I asked, a bit taken aback. "Like it just really doesn't seem like you." He shrugged his shoulders and mulled over what I had just said. "Yeah," he replied eventually. "But I know ghosts are real. I've met one." Upon hearing this statement, I had to know the story. You see, my dad is like me. He likes to tell stories. I could retell most of his stories from memory just because he would tell them so frequently to anyone who would listen. Yet, here was a story I never heard, of any event that changed my dad's life. To this day, I don't know if I believe it or not, but when someone who is so influential in your life, someone who seems to be logical and so down to earth, tells you something like this, it calls into question what you believe and why. Though he never brings it up, when I talk to him about it, he swears it's completely true. No exaggeration and no doubt in his mind about what happened. Here it is, told from his point of view. It was back in the house in Tacoma where you grew up until you were about 4. My parents still lived in the house, but I was going to college. I was back visiting them for a weekend. I was just over at Tacoma Community College, so it wasn't far away. I came back often to visit and get a home-cooked meal. I remember that I was sitting down for dinner with my parents, just the 3 of us. It was in the late spring, early summer season, so it hadn't really gotten dark yet. We were talking like normal, when the phone rang in the kitchen. My mom got up and answered the phone, leaving my dad and me in the room together, alone. After a short while, she called my dad into the kitchen as well. "Leo, can you come in here for a moment?" I remember she seemed worried. Her voice was shaking a bit. My dad wiped his face, got up, and joined my mom in the kitchen. They weren't in there for long, but they were talking quietly, and it felt strange. After a few moments, they came out of the kitchen. They had their coats on now. "Something's come up, and we have to go out for a bit," my mom said. "There's dessert in the fridge. Help yourself. Don't worry about the dishes. I'll wash them when I get back." My dad said nothing, but I could tell from his face that it was serious. My mom looked genuinely worried. They were out of the door in a flash, and I was left to finish my dinner at the table. I cleared the table and washed my plate, despite my mom's instructions. Then I went into the main room to read. I sat down on the sofa and opened up one of my school books and began to relax. Hours went by, and my parents still hadn't come back. It was now around 11 o'clock, and I was just about to get ready for bed. I walked up the stairs, making my way to the bathroom, when I heard a strange noise. I paused and listened for a while. It was the ceiling. The ceiling was making a slow, drawn-out, whining noise. The wood was creaking gently. It wasn't an unusual sound, but there was an unusual rhythm to it that made me uncomfortable and curious. After listening a while, I pulled down the steps to the attic and listened a bit more. I could hear the sound more clearly now, along with a metallic creaking noise. I gathered up my courage, decided to investigate, and climbed down the steps. No, I have to say, I wasn't scared. I didn't have an uneasy feeling. Actually, the contrary. I felt quite comfortable. Even though it was dark and eerie, the energy in the room wasn't foreboding. It felt almost warm and inviting. As I looked around the attic, it quickly became obvious where the sound was coming from. Among the boxes and various other storage was an old rocking chair, one that belonged to my grandmother. It was one of the many possessions she left with us at the house. She was in a nearby home for the elderly and couldn't fit much of her belongings in her room. The rocking chair was gently rocking back and forth, causing the floorboards to creak beneath it. Next to the chair, an old birdcage was displaying a similar behavior. The cage door was gently swinging open and closed, making a quiet metallic creak. I figured there was a draft, and knowing that the sounds would keep me up all night if I didn't put an end to it, I set out in search of the source. I combed the corners of the room, but try as I might, I couldn't find the source of the draft, nor could I feel it myself. There were no windows, and there wasn't much ventilation. It wasn't even windy outside. It was a calm evening. Furthermore, the chair was heavy, as was the birdcage, yet there were other things nearby that weren't disturbed, stacks of paper and the like. After a while, I gave up and looked back at the chair. It was still gently rocking. I walked over to it and rested my hand on the armrest. The chair stopped rocking. Still, I couldn't feel any kind of draft. I left my hand, and the chair was calm and quiet. But as I turned away, I heard the creaking again. I turned back, and the chair was still rocking. It was really strange, but as I said before, I wasn't really creeped out. I shrugged it off and walked over to the birdcage. The door was slowly swinging open and closed. The cage had once housed a parrot belonging to my grandmother, but it had been empty now for some time. I latched the cage shut, figuring I could at least stop this one sound. I made for the steps, but just as I went about halfway down, I heard the metallic creaking again. I looked behind me, and the cage door was back to it, swinging open, unlatched, right alongside the chair, which continued rocking as before. Something had caused it to unlatch. I was sure I latched it properly. In any other circumstance, I would have been scared out of my mind, but for whatever reason, I wasn't. I just didn't feel uneasy. A rocking chair and a birdcage aren't really the harbingers of doom anyway. I descended from the attic with a last glance at the strange behavior and went about my bedtime routine. The creaking continued for a while and I couldn't sleep for it. I went back downstairs to where I couldn't hear the noise and continued reading. It was a little after midnight when I heard my parents pulling into the driveway. They came in and found me reading, and they sat down with me. My mom was crying. They explained to me that they'd spent the evening at the hospital where my grandmother had just passed away. That's the story as my dad tells it. He believes to this day that before she left this world, his grandmother came home to pay him one last visit. When the little ghost first started coming to me, he whispered nice things that would make me feel good.
You have pretty hands. I love how you do your nails. How did you get your skin to be so smooth?
He stayed with me all day and all night. As the days went by, though, I must have done something to make the ghost angry. Instead of mawkish pleasantries, the messages grew negative.
I've seen other girls with prettier hands. What happened to your nails? I'm sorry your skin looks so dry nowadays.
I started to get upset. I'd grown fond of the little ghost. Since he'd always been so positive, it was comforting. But once he started to get mean, I wondered what I'd done wrong. I didn't want my ghost to feel like I'd disappointed him. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw the ghost in the mirror. He looked up at me as I brushed my teeth and said, with sadness in his voice,
Your cuticles are so ragged and ugly.
I looked down at my hands. He was right. I hadn't been taking care of them at all since I started that art class. Bits of skin and hangnails spouted from each cuticle. They were red and angry.
Can you get rid of them for me?
The ghost sounded so hopeful, I couldn't bear to make him feel like I wasn't the good person he initially believed me to be. What if he left? I grabbed the corner of a thick hangnail on the side of my left middle finger. I started to pull it backward. It hurt terribly. The ghost, his eyes brimming with hope, told me I was doing such a great job. Even though the pain of what I was doing, I was overwhelmed by relief. I was finally doing something right. I kept working on the hangnail. After a little while, I'd pulled a thin strip from the side of my finger up my hand and across my arm to the inside of my elbow. It stung terribly, but as tears of joy flooded from the ghost's eyes, I started to wonder if things were getting back to normal.
Your hands look a tiny bit better,
the ghost informed me.
Maybe someday you can be pretty again.
I spent the next hour tearing the skin and nails from my fingers. Even though they bled and I thought they looked terrible, the ghost smiled and assured me I had the hands of an angel. Through my tears, I smiled. As the days went by, I did what I could to make the ghost happy. Sometimes he'd get in a bad mood. Just the other night, he told me the skin on my lips was ugly and chapped. I pulled the chapped skin away. Some of it went pretty far up my cheeks before it tore, but it was okay. The ghost talked on and on about how kissable I'd become. My parents arrived at my apartment this morning. They hadn't said they were coming, but it was a nice surprise. It had been a while, but when they first saw my face and my hands, they were horrified. My mom sobbed, "What happened to your beautiful face?" My dad, almost at the same time, exclaimed, "Oh my God, your hands are ruined." Tears started to leak from my eyes. Off in the corner, my ghost sighed.
They're the ones who make us so sad, aren't they?
I agreed. 10 minutes later, as I worked to saw their bodies into small parts, I asked the ghost if he'd be happier now that they weren't around. No answer. I turned around to see if he was listening. The little ghost was gone.